Today, Alternative Views will interview Pete Bruton concerning his book, The Mafia, CIA, and George Bush. Pete is a former Houston Post reporter who broke the story of the connections between the S&L scandal and the CIA, exposing how CIA assets would borrow money from the S&Ls to finance off-the-book operations and then declare bankruptcy and leave U.S. taxpayers with the bill. Well, for the past 5 years, Pete has been tracking down who actually profited from the S&L scam, who the main players were, and how they skimmed off their money. Lo and behold, Pete discovered that the beneficiaries of the S&L scandals were friends of George Bush and his family, unsavory folks connected to the CIA and Mafia, as well as associates of Texas big shots such as Senator Lloyd Bentsen and Houston power broker Walter Mischer. Well, obviously, this is an explosive story, and today we are going to explore the full ramifications of the S&L crisis with author Pete Bruton, who's now a law student here at the University of Texas.
Pete, this is such an incredible story, one that is so complex, it seems to me almost one impossible to tell, but you do it so well in your book. Before we get into the intricacies of it, I wonder if you can tell us how George Bush himself was involved in this. His family was, but was he himself involved much?
Bush's role was on many levels. First of all, as vice president during the Reagan-Bush years, he was the head of the Reagan-Bush deregulation efforts across the board, and that included savings and loans. And the deregulation of savings and loans that occurred primarily in 1982 with the St. Germain-Garn bill basically opened up savings and loans to the crooks. S&Ls had traditionally just done home mortgage lending to middle-class Americans, and they succeeded very well for 50 years. They had some problems then in the late 70s and early 80s with the inflation, so the Reagan-Bush administration and Congress decided that they were going to deregulate, quote-unquote, savings and loans. And this allowed S&Ls to basically invest their money and lend their money on anything they wanted to, and was an open invitation to the criminal element. And sure enough, the Mafia was one of the first groups involved in looting S&Ls in the early 80s. And the deregulation that Bush was in charge of did that. Bush also, as vice president, either he or his top aides intervened in the federal regulation of the biggest failed savings loan in the country at that time, Sunrise Savings in Boynton Beach, Florida. The CEO of Sunrise went up to Bush's office when he was vice president, and the story varied. He tells one story one time and one story another. He either met with Bush's top aides, included C. Boyden Gray, who is the current White House counsel. And he asked them to get the federal regulators off his back. They were trying to stop Sunrise from basically throwing their assets away. And 1 week after he met with these people, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board that regulates savings and loans withdrew a very stringent cease and desist order against Sunrise and replaced it with a weak supervisory agreement. And a congressional study found that this move cost taxpayers possibly $100 million or more in keeping Sunrise open. Sunrise was then closed down a year later, year and a half later, at a cost to the federal taxpayers of $700 million. And there was no Federal Home Loan Bank Board investigation. It was just shut down. We find if you look at the major borrowers at Sunrise, you find Mafia people, you find CIA people, and you find a Houston businessman named John Riddle, who ties into the circle of Houston businessmen that George Bush comes from. And Riddle, at this time, was involved in the transshipment of arms to the Middle East. Now, the top #2 official at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, Ann Fairbanks, was in this meeting with the Sunrise CEO when he was asking them to get the feds off his back. Her husband, Richard Fairbanks, was in charge at that time of the State Department's efforts to keep arms from Iran, called Operation Staunch. He quit a year later and became the Washington lawyer and lobbyist for Iraq, and worked with Iraq until Iraq invaded Kuwait. Now, it's interesting also to note that the largest failed S&L in the country that did not have a Federal Home Loan Bank Board investigation, Sunrise was number 2 largest. The largest was Hill Financial in Red Hill, Pennsylvania, that plays a big part in my book. And the number 2 borrower at Hill Financial was John Riddle's buddy, a Houston builder named Mike Atkinson, who at that time was transshipping arms to the Middle East. So you find a connecting thread here of arms to the Middle East and savings and loans. And Bush's office was directly involved in keeping this Sunrise Savings open and was lending money to John Riddle.
It seems like such a complex thing, but it seems everywhere you look there are certain things going on. The CIA and the Mafia, and there were drugs that were being run back into the United States. There were illegal arms being procured and sent to the Contras as well as to Iran.
And Iraq, as we now know.
And Iraq. But all of these interests coincided. The Mafia, now how did the Mafia, was the Mafia just after money? Is that how, and perhaps the selling of drugs when they came back into the United States?
I think the Mafia just found it as another, trough they could feed at. And I think they were in on it at the beginning when they knew what deregulation was going to do. And the fact that they figured out a scheme, and the head of this scheme was a New York mobster named Mario Renda, who went to jail for like less than 3 years. He was convicted in New York, Florida, and Kansas City. Renda would collect money from various institutions like pension funds and credit unions, bundle it up into $100,000 bundles so it's covered by federal deposit insurance, and then place it in savings and loans all across the country, billions of dollars. And once he got the money, the deposits into an S&L, he could basically control them. He had a hammer over their head. If they didn't do with this money what he wanted to, he'd just pull it out. And this was called linked financing. He would place the deposits and then tell the S&Ls to loan the money, to lend the money to his buddies. They would then just rip it off, take it and rip it off. Now, in Texas, we found a Louisiana mobster named Herman K. Beebe, who was controlling S&Ls in a different way than Renda. And we found Beebe and Renda together in many, many different places across the country, many connections between the two. But Beebe would actually finance the purchase of savings and loans by his associates like Don Dixon at Vernon, Carroll Kelly at Continental, Jarrett Woods at Western, Roy Daly at First Savings of East Texas. And then he would have a hammer over their head where he was holding the note on their stock to the S&L so they would do what he wanted to.
I think it's so significant, what you've pointed out, that this isn't just something, these relationships aren't something which came together suddenly when they said, oh, hey, here's a great big pig, let's cut it up. This was just a continuation of relationships between powerful people at various levels, state, local, and national, that have been going on for some time.
Well, that's correct. In fact, we had a sort of dry run on the S&L scandal in the mid-'70s in Texas with the so-called Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal, where we have the same people that showed up in the S&L crisis ripping off small Texas banks and doing the same thing, trading bad loans between each other, trading capital stock loans between each other. And Herman K. Beebe was in the middle of that. Ben Barnes, his business partner, was in the middle of it. And then later, Ben Barnes and John Conley show up as big, big borrowers at many of the dirtiest S&Ls in the country. George Albin, another guy that was involved in savings and loans, was in the Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal. So, and the federal government knew about the Rent-A-Bank scandal. They came in and did an investigation. There was a savings and loan in Texas, in Houston, called Surety, that a woman named Rosemary Stewart was in charge of the federal regulation of in Washington. And she saw Herman K. Beebe, she saw Walter Mischer, she saw Mischer's son-in-law, Robert Corson. And when these people all got back in the S&Ls, 5 to 10 years later, she did nothing. And she was then in charge of the Office of Enforcement of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board.